Okay, let me share my screen. Whoops, that is not what we want to see. Okay, and let me make this small. Okay, so we just read about the Battle of Ai. This took place, of course, after the battle that was fought at Jericho. And you may recall or have listened to the story that the people had violated the Cherem. Actually, one particular person had violated the Cherem and taken spoils from Jericho, spoils which were supposed to be dedicated to God. And as a result, the people in their attack on Ai were unsuccessful. They were routed. They determined who it was who had taken this spoil. Once he was exposed and executed, they went again. And Joshua, saw Joshua last time as a tactician who arranged essentially to ambush the people of Ai and was completely successful. And now we're moving on to really an interesting story, which is, before we do that, we're going to pick up with verse 30. This is chapter 8, verse 30 of the book of Joshua. So after Ai is defeated, Joshua builds an altar to the God of Israel on Mount Ebal. And this really brings us back to Deuteronomy and to what God tells Moses and Moses tells the people should be done when they enter the promised land. It doesn't, here it seems out of place. These things were not done initially. This is only now that they're established in the land of Israel itself. And we'll see this ceremony that takes place with the people, half being on Mount Ebal, half being on the other side, on Mount Gerizim, and the Levites in the valley who will pronounce blessings. So they build there an altar. Joshua builds an altar on Mount Ebal. And Moses, the servant of God, had commanded the Israelites, as written in the book of the teaching of Moses. This is clearly Deuteronomy. And they build it with an altar of unhewn stone upon which no iron had been wielded, right? And this was specified also in the book of Exodus. Right after Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments, the people were told that when they built an altar, it can't be hewn stones. And there is a sense here that iron, which would have been the method of hewing the stones, is used for warfare. And the purpose of the altar is to bring peace between God and the people of Israel. And so any instrument of war should have no connection. And in fact, we'll see with the building of the temple, a similar sort of idea. This is later on when finally the temple, after David conquers Jerusalem and makes it the capital of Israel, brings the ark there to Jerusalem, and wants to build a temple to God. And God says, no, your son will build it. But David, who was the warrior par excellence, is not able to build it. It's his son Shlomo, Solomon, whose name actually is based on the word shalom, meaning peace, and he is able to build it. So the idea of the altar of unhewn stones has to do with something that has not been used in warfare. And they offer their sacrifice, burnt offerings, and sacrifices of well-being, svachim and shlamim. So the burnt offerings are offerings which are completely consumed on the altar. That's why they're called burnt, because they're wholly burnt up. But the sacrifices of well-being, the shlamim, from the word shalom, are sacrifices to be brought by individuals, or in this case, the people as a whole, in gratitude for what God has done for them. And these sacrifices are shared by the people. So it becomes a kind of sacrificial meal that is being shared, as it were, with God. And it's a way of expressing gratitude. Okay, there on the stones, he inscribes a copy of the teaching that Moses had written for the Israelites. This, of course, goes back again to Deuteronomy. And as we saw there, the idea is that the stones are covered with plaster, and then the book is inscribed into the plaster. It's not that they have to be somehow, chipped into the stones themselves. And now we have, and this is straight out of Deuteronomy, all Israel, stranger and citizen alike, with their elders, officials, magistrates, stood on either side of the ark, facing the Levitical priests who carried the ark. Half of them faced Mount Gerizim, half of them faced Mount Ebal, as Moses, the servant of God, had commanded them of old, in order to bless the people of Israel. After that, Moses reads the entire text of the book of Deuteronomy, and the blessing and the curse, just as written there. And there was not a word of all that Moses had commanded Joshua, that of all that Moses had commanded Joshua failed to read. No, there was not a word of all that Moses had commanded that Joshua failed to read in the presence of the whole congregation of Israel, including the women, children, and strangers who accompanied them. Okay, so we have come to now a new chapter and a really, I think, interesting story. So when the kings west of the Jordan in the hill country in Shephelah, along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, set up in the vicinity of Lebanon, the land of the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. They learned of it. They gathered with one accord to fight against Joshua and Israel. But the inhabitants of Gibeon learned how Joshua had treated Jericho and Ai, and they, for their part, resorted to cunning. So they have a stratagem that they're going to use to save themselves, to protect themselves. And it's interesting, this comes right after the defeat of Ai, where Joshua also uses cunning. There they pretend to be in retreat, having sent other troops out. And so there is this surrounding of the people of Ai, having pretended to retreat in order to lure them into a trap. So here too, we have cunning immediately afterwards. And what do the people of Gibeon do? They set out in disguise. They take worn out sacks for their donkeys and worn out water skins that are cracked and parched. They had worn out patched sandals on their feet and threadbare clothes on their bodies. And all the bread they took as provision was dry and crumbly. And so they went to Joshua in the camp of Gilgal in parley, said to him and to the rest of Israel's side, "We come from a distant land, and we propose that you make a pact with us," right? So they are saying that they want to be allies. They've heard the renown of Joshua and the Israelites. They don't live nearby. They're not, therefore, in the land that God had required the Israelites to conquer, but they were far away. And Israel's side in this negotiation respond to them, but perhaps you live among us, right? Maybe you're in the land. You're the people we need to conquer. How then can we make a pact with you? And they said to Joshua, we'll be your servants. Joshua asked them, who are you? Where do you come from? And they reply, your servants come from a very distant country because of the fame of the eternal your God, for we had heard the report of all you did in Egypt and all that your God did in Egypt, all your God did to the Amorite kings on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og. So our elders and the inhabitants of our country instructed us as follows: take provisions for a trip and go to them and say, we will be your subjects. Come make a pact with us. Right? So this is the way they explain themselves. And then they show him this bread of ours, which we took from our houses of provision, was still hot when we set out. See how dry and crumbly it has become. The wineskins were new when we filled them. See how they have become cracked. Clothes and sandals are worn out from the very long journey. Those invoked took their word for it because of their provisions, and did not inquire of God, right? So as we had seen previously, when they were trying to determine who had violated the Cherem, who had taken spoil from Joshua, there is a way of inquiring of God, probably using the Urim and Tumim, which are in the breastplate of the high priest. But they didn't do that. And of course, we're going to see that that was a mistake. So Joshua establishes now a treaty with them, makes a pact with them to spare their lives. And the chieftains of the community, that is the community of Israel, give their oath. That is to say, they swear an oath to God that they will make peace with this people. But when 3 days had passed after they made this pact with them, they learned, in fact, that they were neighbors living among them. So they set out, and on the third day they came to their towns, Gibeon and so on. But the Israelites did not attack them, since the chieftains of the community had sworn by the Eternal, the God of Israel. And the community muttered against the chieftains, right? The chieftains answered the whole community. We swore to them by the Eternal, the God of Israel. Therefore, we cannot touch them. I'm going to go on with the story in a minute, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And if there are questions, comments up to this point in the story, either about those ceremonies at the end of the last chapter, or about the ruse of the Gibeonites, any questions, any comments before we go on? All right, Francesca, I can't tell if you're raising your hand.
No, I can't get the screen off.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
No, it's fine.
I'll be home in a minute. I'm almost there.
Okay, great, no problem. Barry, go ahead.
Yeah, it seems to me that a pact made based upon a lie would be
Yes.
null and void.
So,
could be.
yes, you asked exactly the right question, right? So what does it mean? They were tricked, right? And if they were tricked, can't this contract be nullified, right? And we see actually in later law, in Jewish law, that that's exactly the case. If you can show that there were false pretenses, you can invalidate the covenant, even to the extent of nullifying a marriage. If one side had tricked the other side, claiming to be someone that they're not, or not to have the wealth that they have or whatever it is. So why not? And here the key is that it is an oath sworn to God. And the assumption is that once you take an oath, you've made God a kind of guarantor of that oath, and there is no going back. We're going to see when we get to the book of Judges, very famous story about Yiftach, who's one of the judges, military leaders of Israel, who in the midst of a battle swears that he will sacrifice whatever comes out of his house. And it turns out that it is his daughter when he comes back victorious. And it is not an oath that he can get out of because he's sworn it to God. Now, the rabbis, when we come to the Talmudic period, are not happy about this idea that no oaths can't be nullified. And so they do two things. One is that they strongly discourage the taking of oaths. It seems in the Bible to have been a positive thing, but in the rabbinic world, it's a negative thing because a person might come into a circumstance where they have to fulfill something which they really can't or shouldn't. The other thing they do is they allow for the nullification of oaths. It's clear that in the Bible, oaths cannot be nullified, but the rabbis do it. They talk about, they establish a rabbinic court. You can come before the court for hatra'at nidarim, for the nullification of oaths, and you have to make the case, and in fact, you can do it. And this idea that oaths can be nullified actually is the basis for the Kol Nidre service. Vows are Kol Nidre, Kol Nidarim. All the vows that we have made, vows, oaths, and so on, promises we nullify. It's striking because according the text, which may be the oldest, it's proactive rather than retroactive. The vows that we will make, we hereby nullify. There is a sense in Kol Nidre that human beings are very fallible. They may, either under duress, and there are those who suspect that Kol Nidre came in a time when Jews might be made to swear oaths under duress. If that happens to us, we proactively nullify them, or even perhaps in Kol Nidre, it's a sense of our own frailty, our own failings. When we made the oaths, we meant them, but we could not actually fulfill them. And so knowing that we are weak, we swear this, we make this declaration and proactively nullify our vows. Of course, if it's retroactive, then that's easy, right? That the congregation is constituted as a kind of Beit Din, as a kind of rabbinic court, and thinking back over the years, the vows that we couldn't keep, we now nullify. Sandy, go ahead.
So, Rabbi, you said in biblical times the oath could not be nullified. So, for example, this king and his daughter. So, what would have happened if he didn't kill him?
It would seem that God would punish or plague the people. That when you swear an oath to God, you are essentially saying, and if I don't keep this oath, may God punish me. God becomes a kind of guarantor of this oath. So here, the Gibeonites very cleverly have managed to outsmart the Israelites, getting an oath under false pretenses, which we might think could be nullified, which if they lived in the time of the rabbis would be nullified, but in biblical times, no such thing. And so they are stuck with the Gibeonites. Now, I want to draw before we go back and see the outcome here, I want to draw a certain conclusion from here, and also we'll see a little bit later. The conquest is really incomplete. The Gibeonites are an outstanding example, but the truth is that the Israelites do not conquer the entire land. And later in the book of Judges, we'll see that peoples are living among them. This is a kind of idealized vision of what should have happened, could have happened, not clear, but it doesn't happen, despite the fact that we're going to see very triumphalist language later in the book of Joshua. It seems that it doesn't happen. When we come to the, we see a battle to take over Jerusalem, for example, the Jebusites there, David conquers the city, also with a kind of trick as he sneaks in through a water channel that goes into the city and is able to conquer it. So it's just not the case. And there are scholars who believe that the conquest was not all at once. It was gradual. It took place over a long period of time, and that they lived together in the cities, Israelites and Canaanites, throughout this period. Joshua seems to suggest that, though it's also clear that there were conquests. And we have archaeological remains from this period, which seems to, depicts the destruction of cities and the burning of cities. And then the beginning after that, as we look back to pottery and other things, the beginning of Israelite settlement in the land. So it's a very mixed picture. Okay, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen, and here we go. So the people complain that how can you spare them? And I think the people are afraid. They've seen what happened before. And when the Cherem was violated, and they say, how can you do this? They say to their leaders, and they said, we swore to God, therefore we can't touch them. This is what we'll do. We'll spare their lives. So there may be no wrath against us because of the oath we swore them. The wrath is, God, who enforces this covenant, will punish them. And the chieftains declared concerning them, they shall live, and they shall become hewers of wood and drawers of water for the whole community, as the chieftains decreed concerning them. So they will be at the lowest level of Israelite society. Although we know, when Moses gathers the people together towards the end of the book of Deuteronomy, and it says they are all there from the highest officials, the leaders of the tribes, all the way down there to hewers of wood, drawers of water. Right? So the top of society, the bottom of society. And Joshua summons them and speaks to them. Why did you deceive us and tell us you were far from us? You live among us. You are in the land. Therefore, be you accursed. Never shall your descendants cease to be slaves, hewers of wood, drawers of water, for the house of God. So here, it's interesting, I think, because they are slaves, but they are, and they have very low occupations. But look, it becomes for the house of God, because it is perhaps, and I'm just speculating here, it is because God is the one who protected them. And they replied to Joshua, you see, your servants have heard that the eternal your God promised Moses to give you the whole land, to wipe out all the inhabitants of the country. We were in great fear for our lives, and this is why we did this thing. And now we're at your mercy. Do with us what you consider right and proper. And he did He saved them from being killed by the Israelites. And this now final statement, I just want to, where am I here? Yes. Yes. The statement, as they still are, seems to reflect a later period, again, when the Gibeonites, who are this sort of servant class, continue to have this role, looking back. And again, I think another suggestion for the idea that the land is not wholly conquered. Okay, so we move on to the next battle. And we're going to see King Adoni-Zedek of Jerusalem. Adoni-Zedek is probably not his name. It's rather, it literally means master of justice, but it's probably the name of his role rather than a personal name, just as Pharaoh in Egypt is, a name for his role, not his actual name. And when Adoni-Zedek learned that Joshua had captured Ai and prescribed it, treating Ai and his king as he had treated Jericho and its king, that moreover, the inhabitants of Gibeon had come to terms with Israel, it's very frightened. Gibeon was a large city, far larger than Ai, and its men were warriors. So he sends message to Hebron, King Piram of Yarmouth, Japhia of Lachish, and Dever of Eglon. And he says, let us go and defeat Gibeon, for it has come to terms with Joshua and the Israelites. Right, so they're traitors, and we're going to go get them. And they go, and they march on Gibeon and encamp against it. And the people of Gibeon send message to Joshua at Gilgal. Do not fail your servants. Come quickly and aid us and deliver us, for all the Amorite kings of the hill country have gathered against us, right? So they have a treaty. They've made a pact. And one of the obligations of the Israelites now is to defend. You could call it a mutual defense pact, but the Israelites don't need the Amorites to defend them. Joshua marches from Gilgal and all his combat troops, all the trained warriors. The trained warriors seem to be the advance guard, particular elite troops. God says to Joshua, don't be afraid of them. I will deliver them into your hands. Not one of them will withstand you. Joshua takes them by surprise. He marches all night from Gilgal. So the idea is they're very close by Gibeon. He goes through the night, and God throws these 5 kings into a panic before Israel. Joshua inflicts a crushing defeat on them, pursuing him in the direction of the Beit Horon ascent, all the way to Azekah and Makkedah. And while they were fleeing, God hurls huge stones on them from the sky, all the way to Azekah, and they perished. More perished from the hailstones than were killed by Israelite weapons. So this seems to be a supernatural intervention by God, although it's clear that it's hail. So enormous hail that kills them. This shows that God is really with them and protecting them. On that occasion, when God routed the Amorites before the Israelites, Joshua addresses God. He said in the presence of the Israelites, and it's very poetic in the Hebrew, stand still, O sun at Gibeon, O moon in the valley of Ajalon. So, Joshua asked the sun to stand still, And so that daylight will continue, and they will be able to continue destroying these five nations. The sun stands still, the moon halted, while a nation wreaked judgments on its foes, as it is written in the book of Yashar. Thus the sun halted mid-heaven and did not press on to set the entire day. So these are these two divine interventions. And here we see Joshua again as sort of the second Moses. These look like, if you think about them, plagues. Hail is obvious. It's exactly like the plague that takes place at the time of the Exodus. And I would also argue that the sun standing still is in some ways like the plague of darkness, only of course it's a plague of light in this case. And then we get this statement, as is written in the book of Yashar, thus the sun halted in mid-heaven and did not press to set the whole day. So the book of Yashar seems to be an ancient lost book. And this story, the story of this victory, is being cross-referenced here to the book of Yashar, which one assumes could be in part a reference for this narrative, which is built around events in the book of Yashar. Now, Yashar means straight, but probably it's a reference to the first word of the book. That's how books are generally described, right? Bereshit, for example, Hebrew name for the book of Genesis, is called Bereshit because Bereshit is the first word in the book. So perhaps the Yashar is the first word, and some scholars speculate that it's really Yashir, to sing, that this was a book that was sung. You can imagine, for example, like the story of the crossing of the sea. Once they come through, Az Yashir Moshe Uvnei Israel, thus sung Moses and the people of Israel. The sun halted, did not press on, for God fought for Israel. Neither before or since has there been such a day when God acted on the words spoken by someone else. Not quite true, because we do see Moses saying certain things, making, when he speaks to Pharaoh, saying such and such will happen, and then God causes it to happen. So despite this statement, one could say never again, but never before seems to, in some ways, to strengthen our image of Joshua. Then Joshua, together with all Israel, returned to the camp at Gilgal. Meanwhile, those five kings fled. They hid in a cave. When it was reported to Joshua that they had been found hiding in the cave, Joshua orders, roll huge stones against the mouth of the cave, post some men to guard over them. But as for the rest, don't stop, press on, don't let them reach their towns, don't let them fall back to their fortified towns. The Eternal your God has delivered them, and they do it, and they return to the camp having done it. No one actually is able to snare them. And Joshua orders, open the mouth of the cave, bring the five kings out, and they're brought out to Joshua, and everyone comes forward. He says, place your feet on the necks of the kings, and they place their feet there. This is really a kind of humiliation. Joshua says, don't be frightened or dismayed, be firm or resolute, for this is what God is going to do to all the enemies with whom you are at war. Right, so they should see this, and they should be heartened by it, and they should go and do what they do, and Joshua puts them to death. impales them on a stake. And then they're taken down and they're put in the cave, and stones are put around the mouth of the cave, and they are there to this very day. Okay, I'm going to stop here, stop sharing. Any comments now on the rest of this battle and what happens? Yeah.
I have a couple of things.
Saul first.
Oh, sorry.
And then you're second. Go ahead.
The poetry here reminds me of the poetry in Chukat after the battles of Sichon and Og. You know, very similar.
Yes.
And it said the book of the wars or something.
Yes, that's right.
Sefer HaMilchama.
Right. It's Milchamot Adonai, right? Right.
Yeah.
Book of God's wars, right? So yes, I think the poetry is similar, but here it's quite specific to these kind of supernatural events. Something I should have mentioned before, I compared this to the plagues. And the thing about the plagues also is that they move from things that are naturalistic, they're even repeated, the early ones by the Egyptian magicians, to things that could not be naturalistic, like light in the camp of the Israelites and darkness among the Egyptians. And here too, we see something like that. Hailstones, right? You could see hailstones as being naturalistic, though they come at the right time and in the right place. But, by the time you get to the end, right, the sun standing still in the sky, no, you're beyond that. Francesca.
Couple of things, completely unrelated. First, I think it's fascinating that the reason why the people give for not doing wrong is so God doesn't punish them. And, as a psychologist, I think about levels of moral, ethical development. That's like grammar school, as opposed to not doing it because it's the right thing to do. And I just think that was fascinating. There may not be anything about that, but that's where my brain went. And go ahead if you want to say anything about that, and then I'll ask about the other
The only
question.
thing I'll say about it is that this to do otherwise would be a violation of the Ten Commandments, right? It is swearing a false oath, right? That is specific in there. So if you bring God in as your, guarantor, then you have no option but to do what you did. But I agree that you would assume, for example, that not killing them out of humanitarian impulses would be far better, on an ethical level, at least as we see modern times ethics, than not killing them because you're afraid of the consequences, right? But from the point of view of the Bible, the worst thing you can do is to affront God, right? That
makes sense.
It's really outside, you could say, the ethical realm. Yes, and you said there was something else.
Yeah, related to this about killing them, it's such an incredibly gruesome image in my head. And then the funny part of my brain was thinking, how do they have 5 kings in one cave? Who puts himself in charge of that zoo? That must have been like. But no, seriously, does that make him? I know that, for example, crucifixion was not just about Christ. That was one of the things they did to punish people. So this is sort of in the same realm, more or less, about impaling them. And again, it's so gruesome to me that I'm having a hard time reading it.
Yes. So yes, it was a common practice in ancient times. This is a way of disgracing your enemy. It takes place after death, right? So it's not, they aren't killed by impaling. And this is true, by the way, of Haman's sons also. It's after their death that
Right.
they're hung up or perhaps even impaled there. The language might suggest that. So it's not unusual. What is striking, though, and this also is a fulfillment of the Torah, the body is not allowed to be up there only until night. And then it has to be taken down, and it has to be, in this case, placed in a cave, right? That you disgrace them, but their body is also, you also recognize on a certain level their humanity, and there are limits. Whereas in other ancient peoples, they are displayed over time, and just to continue the gruesomeness of this, and then the birds are going to come and peck them, and all those
course.
things that are going to happen.
I was waiting for that part.
They and they rot away. It's not that. Now, the other thing to mention, of course, is that this is how people were buried in antiquity. They were buried in caves. They were not buried in the ground.
No,
And later on in the Talmudic period, the process was to lay them out in caves, and then after the flesh has gone, to gather the bones, and the bones themselves were placed in chests, ossuaries, right? Glusgamot in Hebrew. And they were gathered there, they're put in these chests, and then the chests remain in the cave. So it's not like you have skeletons just sort of there. And if you get to Israel and you get to the Israel Museum, they have huge archaeological displays. You can see these things. You can see they're sort of carved on the outside. They look very Hellenistic. But we also see, of course, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their families, with the exception of Rachel, are buried in Hebron in a cave. So this is not unusual here. It's not a sign of disgrace. It's just the way it was done.
but it was.
Sandy. Go ahead, Sandy.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Rabbi, when it says the text says, and God spoke to Joshua, and I guess other people too in the Bible, how is that interpreted? Is it like speaking, like you hear the voice, someone else would hear it, or is it in his head?
Right.
Or
So the answer to that depends on who you ask, right? Maimonides famously says God does not speak, period, because that would mean God has a mouth, God has vocal cords, right? That somehow the divine voice is heard or intuited. The Bible speaks in the language of human beings, in a way so that it becomes a kind of metaphor. We say that God speaks. That's Maimonides. Is there something else that we see? This interesting example, the Ten Commandments, as you know, occurs both in the book of Exodus and also in the book of Deuteronomy, when Moses recaps the history of the people, and the commandment to observe Shabbat. In one case, it says Zohoret Yom HaShabbat, to remember Shabbat. In the other case, it says Shamor et Yom HaShabbat, to observe Shabbat. And so very famously, and you see this actually in Lecha Dodi, based on a midrash, Shamor v'Zachor b'Yom Echad, but right at the same time, as if God's message, God's speech somehow can say two words simultaneously, and then they're heard separately. Right? So there already we get this sense that God's speaking is not what we think of as speech. But do they hear it in their mind? It's very hard to say. Beyond, we see in already in the book of Joshua, how do we find out what God has to say? Well, we have to divine it. We have to use, the Urim and Tumim. But God also seems to be talking to Joshua. So not clear what that means. Barry,
Thank you.
Yeah, so, a related question, how does God speaking to Joshua differ from God speaking to Moses?
so, on a certain level, we know about Moses that no one's, the metaphor, again, it's a metaphor, is no one spoke, that God spoke to Moses face to face, like one person speaks to another, and no one else was spoken to like that. So there is that sense. The image is used that God speaks to Moses, clearly, and everyone else, it's like through a veil or through a smoky mirror. They don't see God speaking. By the way, one of my favorite sort of statements about biblical study is that studying the Bible in translation is like kissing a bride through a veil. Right? That the language is not exactly, you can't quite get it right. It's not as it is. Of course, it's the best we can do unless we can read Hebrew, and we've seen that already, where one translation uses one word and another translation uses another word, and sometimes those are very significant differences. Francesca.
Is there any evidence or that God spoke with Abraham?
Whoops.
Absolutely. God, if you look at the patriarchs, God is definitely talking to Abraham.
But not face to face like he did with Moses. How come Moses is so special?
Well,
Abraham started the whole mess.
so with Moses, the idea is God speaks to Moses like he speaks to no other people.
I remember reading that.
But you see in the story of Abraham itself, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that God speaks to each successive generation. God communicates with each successive generation in slightly different ways. And God seems to be withdrawing from direct communication. So God says to Abraham, thus and so. By the time you get to Joseph, it's all in a dream. And even Jacob has a dream. So it's clear that that's not direct speech, and it needs to be interpreted. Anything else? So we're going to pick up next time. And if not next time, the time afterwards, we're going to finish the book of Joshua.
Just mute the song.
Even though we're
So
only on chapter 8,
your voice cannot be heard. But
but there are two things in the book of Joshua beyond these initial stories, very little else except they went here and conquered this people, and they went there and conquered that people, and then they went and so on and so on and so on, and we get lists of everyone they conquered. And then, with a few exceptions we're going to look at, and then they divide the land. And this tribe gets this, and that tribe gets that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of the book, almost all of the book, will be those things. It's extremely tedious and repetitive, and we're not going to do it. We will skip those sections, and we'll read the narrative portions. I'll have something to say about those sections, but we're not going to read them. And likely we'll finish the book of Joshua next time. If not next time, then the time after that. We are closing in on Pesach. I will certainly finish it before Pesach. If we have a session immediately before Pesach, we haven't finished the book, I want to look at the Song of Songs. We'll spend a session on that. It's the book which is read in its entirety during Pesach. So it seems like a worthy thing to look at. And then we will move on probably with the book of Judges, which is the next book and has all kinds of wonderful material in it. Samson, for example, and Deborah, and so much else. So that would be the next thing we do. But we will, certainly before Pesach, we are going to finish the book of Joshua. So I hope to see you all next week. I want to wish you a great week, and we'll pick up then. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Rabbi.
Back.